Hello, aviation enthusiasts and friends of airplanes. Welcome to Tryon Estates Aviation Group Lockheed Constellation presentation. My name is Joe Dettle of the Aviation Group. I think most of you know me. I'm not too fast with computers, but just bear with me because sometimes it gets ahead of me. You may need to adjust the volume of your TV sets in your apartments on occasion. Today we are going to talk about one of America's favorite airplanes, two of which operated here in North Carolina for several years and provided many jobs for Carolinians. You'll probably hear me talk about me and we during this presentation, and that's because I was employed by the company that owned these two aircraft as a pilot, and more recently was involved with with preserved aircraft in the air show business or air show circuit. This is going to be the history of these two airplanes, November 6912 Charlie and 6922 Charlie. They were manufactured together and flew together for many years. They have a place together in North Carolina's local history, and this is their life story from beginning to end. There she comes in all her beauty. This aircraft is currently flying in Australia. It's part of the air show circuit there and is flying today. We'll just take a minute and let it taxi on in, and then we'll continue. One trademark of this particular type of airplane of that generation and air is the squeaking brakes. You can hear it squeaking, it's music to an old-timer's ears. Notice the sets, the landing gear are quite long. That's to keep the propellers way up in the air so they don't hit anything. The question also comes up of why the aircraft had three tails. Initially it was designed to have one large vertical stabilizer, but it turned out that most of the hangars of that era and generation, it couldn't fit in the hangars, so they reduced it down to three tails, and in actuality probably made a much better looking airplane out of it. This is one of the early aircraft in the being assembled in the factory in Burbank, California. You see, it's quite a large facility with the big cranes that are actually lowering the fuselage down onto the wings that are already in place. Of this particular type of aircraft, the Constellation, approximately 900 were built. 300 went to the military and another 300 to the civilian airlines. Today there are still currently 4 flying. The one that we just saw in the picture from Australia. We're going to see a little video of one in Switzerland that's currently in Frankfurt, Germany. There's one in Bridgewater, Virginia, and Chino, California, and they were flown there last year from the desert The one that went to Bridgewater was the Columbine, which was Eisenhower's presidential airplane. When it was flown from the desert up to Virginia, they had to take the engines off of the airplane, truck them back to Arizona in the desert where the other airplane was, and it was the Baton, or is the Baton, which was General MacArthur's personal airplane. And with the engines from the other airplane, they flew it to a museum in Chino, California, and it is currently flying when they can find enough of the engines to go around. This is the assembly line in the Burbank factory. Note it's quite cluttered. Lots of ladders, step ladders, doesn't look too safe necessarily. Supply places, lots of people. If you look through there, you see quite a crowd. And you know it had to be quite a process when they decided they were going to move this line, and all of this stuff had to be moved. We're going in to look at the cockpit of a finished airplane. That generation of airplane had large yokes because they're largely mechanically powered, although they did have hydraulic boost. And this is what was the yoke that made the right, left, and up, down turns. And down here, next to the pilot's left knee, was a large steering wheel, probably about 8 inches in diameter, that was used to taxi the airplane around. You saw the big nose wheel, how it turned and went, and worked quite well. There's 4 engines, so there's 4 throttles of 4 levers for reversing the engines on landing. The rudder is set here with these knobs of ailerons and the elevator. You notice this being one, this little handle will pop out and extend out here, and it gives leverage to the crew members to turn the knob because it was all mechanical. There's trim tabs for the elevator down here on the sides and the flaps and the gear lever and all that. And this little section right down here would pop open, and a radar set would come up that had the weather radar in it where both crew members could observe it. Back here's the flight engineer station with quite a large number of instruments, and there's a better picture of that. The flight engineer had duplicates of everything that the pilot had up there. There's about 5 different sets of levers here, from the throttles to the superchargers. Each propeller had one, the mixtures, the fuel shutoff levers. The flight engineer had access to all of these and could make changes on the instrument, on the power levers here when the pilot fell asleep, I guess. The radio panels are up here, the electrical panels here, and all the engine instruments through here. We have another short video we'll run through that will show the duties of the flight engineer. Video is of the airplane that's currently in Germany. It's in the maintenance and overhaul.
Mein Name ist Markus Serle und ich bin seit einem Jahr jetzt auf der Suchungsfläche als Flight-Ingenieur.
Now we'll try starting them so we can see if it'll fly. One thing I'd like to point out right here is because there's so many engines and so few instruments that there had to be duplicate readings on the instruments. For instance, the fuel pressures for the 4 engines is on just 2 gauges, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you'll notice the same thing on the inlet temperatures. It's 1, 2, 2 engines on the same instrument, and 3 and 4 over here, and you see 2 instruments down here and 2 up here. In order to save space and make it easier on the scan of the flight engineers, each instrument has multiple tasks. Let's see if we can get this thing in the air. There's a picture of the engine. It's the Wright 3350. Puts out about 3,500 or 4,000 horsepower. There's two banks of cylinders, one right here and one right there. It's called a radial engine because they run radically around the drive shaft of the engine. There's 9 big cylinders in each bank, one bank there and 9 more back here. And each cylinder is kind of a round little bucket that fits down over the top there. It's got 2 spark plugs in it. And it can be changed readily just by unbolting it and lifting it off and putting another one back on there. And there's a total of 2 spark plugs on each engine, and that makes 144 spark plugs on the airplane that the flight engineer in takeoff has to monitor to be sure that they're all operating. A cylinder will run with 1 spark plug out, but if you have 2 out, you have to shut down the engine probably as soon as you can because it will shake the whole thing apart. Now let's talk about the company that owned these airplanes. It was Bluebell Incorporated, located in Greensboro, North Carolina. And 50 years ago, it was the largest manufacturer in the company of sports clothes, jeans, uniforms, and that type of stuff, and also quite large into the cowboy boot business, if you can imagine that. Their trademark was the Wrangler jean. It was the largest manufacturer in Puerto Rico, a number of plants there. In 1968, it was crippled by the longshoreman flight, and they were out of business for about 3 or 4 months. So their solution to that was to buy a cargo airplane and fly the products to Puerto Rico and the finished products back instead of using the container ships. Like Sealand was one of the big container ship companies in those days. The first airplane acquired, 6912 Charlie, was built as a freighter with a payload of 42,000 pounds. Now keep that 42,000 pounds in mind, and we'll talk about that later. And then in 1971, 6922 Charlie was purchased and brought onto line. Why did Bluebell buy the Lockheed Constellation? Primarily because it was cheap, dirt cheap really. Carried a big payload. There was a lot of them and a lot of spares. And if a part on your airplane broke, you could actually go down to Miami and buy another airplane and get the part. But if you had the crews and the maintenance people to operate them, they were very efficient. Bluebell also had its own trucking company, which had a terminal very nearby, right down here in Greenville, South Carolina, right off 85. The facility is still there, but it is operated by someone else. Generally speaking, they moved all their products around over the country themselves. They also did all the printing. They had a big printing shop. They printed up all of their own labels, and they just like to keep everything in their own hands. This is the 2 airplanes that were acquired. We saw the pictures of the factory. They were built in 1957, and that's like 60 years ago plus. 12 Charlie and 22 Charlie. Flying Tiger Airline purchased 12 of these airplanes, and over a period of a few years, they crashed 7 of them. That's 60%. And their solution to that was to get them back running again was to buy 5 more. So they ended up operating or owning at one time 17 of these cargo airplanes. In the year 1962, they kind of set a record. They crashed 4 of them. And on the Ides of March day, 3/15/962, they crashed 2 in the same day. So they were expendable, and that's probably why they were cheap, but with Bluebell, they operated very efficiently. This is in 1960, the 2 airplanes that we're talking about, 12 Charlie in Seoul, South Korea, and 22 Charlie in Salt Lake City. A year or 2 later, 12 Charlie, a picture in Frankfurt, and 22 Charlies in Burbank, California. At this time, in 1963, it had been acquired by the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. Bought for $500,000, which is a pretty good price. It flew Air America flights to Area 51, and you all remember that out in the desert. They flew 2 flights a day. That's where they were flying the aliens out and forth that were captured from the spaceships that crashed out in the desert, and the scientists to experiment on them and that type of stuff. They also flew arms and ammunition for the Bolivian Revolution, whatever that may be, and like the CIA does all over, it supported distant political needs. Now, another point of interest on this airplane, the 6912 Charlie, is it was scheduled to fly from New Zealand to the Antarctic in 1969. The flight did take place, but it didn't land. It was the second airplane in a flight of 2. The first plane there tried to land in a snowstorm and ran into a snowdrift and was disabled and closed the runway. And consequently, 12 Charlie, the airplane we're talking about, flew back to New Zealand, flew to Minneapolis, was purchased by Wrangler Aviation and flown to Greensboro by, of all people, yours truly. Now, the airplane crashed in a snowdrift. There it is today. These pictures, one of these pictures was taken last year in the Antarctic. 60 years later, it looks to be very well preserved in the cold air, and it's still there. If you look on the internet, you look on the strange airplanes around the world, you'll find pictures of this airplane still sitting in the snowdrift. Looks like it lost its tail on the landing. It must have spun around. Then in 1969, 22 Charlie arrived in Greensboro. For the first year of the operation, it flew out of Winston-Salem, the smaller Winston-Salem airport, and flew into San Juan, Puerto Rico versus the old Aguadilla Ramey Air Force Base that it started going to later. This is its first flight from Greensboro to Ramey Air Force Base, or Borinquen, or Aguadilla, or all the things it's called now. And I would like to mention at this time that there are several other people around the Tryon Estates here, residents, who have considerable experience with these large 4-engine airplanes. Our senior aviator is none other than Sandy Grondike, that's up on the 3rd floor over here. Flew the 4-engine B-17 during World War II. Charles Duke flew the C-119 in Southeast Asia, which had these big radial engines also. And our airline pilot, Dale Miller, flew this big baby during the Cold War. And you can imagine if Wrangler, Bluebell had bought that airplane, how many jeans he could have hauled. In March '69, this is an article out of the Greensboro Daily News saying that Bluebell was flying the airplane. Shortly after that, they acquired an old abandoned National Guard nose dock on the Greensboro Airport. They built a big ramp around it, and used that as the facility to operate this airplane out of. They had a dock here, and like I said earlier, Wrangler had all their own trucks, so they could bring them right up there next to the dock and load the airplane. There's a picture of the nose dock. Notice the area was cut out so the airplane could be towed into there and worked on it during bad or inclement weather. This little guy right here is a Piper Navajo, which was the company's executive aircraft at that time. It went on to eventually to acquire a couple of twin-engined small Cessnas, a 340 and a 421, which was really a nice little airplane. And then from there, as the years went on, they advanced into the Mitsubishis, the MU-2, or commonly known as the Rice Rockets. And then in the later years, they operated a couple of Cessna Citations out of this same flight department. Another article, Bluebell flying the cargo, that's what it looked like in the airplane. They would buy these large rolls of cloth from the mills in this very area. Cone Mills, Burlington Industries was big in those days, Dan River. Milligan still has a office of some type here in Columbus. And Bluebell, as I recall, 60 years ago, had a sewing room here in the town of Columbus where they made the products. And a sewing room, as a lot of people may remember, particularly the ladies, because about 30 to 60 ladies maybe operated a sewing line in these facilities in all the little towns around over the country. This is the route was flown from Greensboro to Puerto Rico, which is right down here under the D. It was about a 6-hour flight in those days, and the initial schedule was to do it twice a week, down one day and back the next, and then take a day on maintenance because there was a lot of maintenance, and the maintenance crews are still learning how to do it. And then there'll be another down and back. And on occasion, it went to Miami, Florida for maintenance, which there was all kinds of mechanics there that knew how to maintain these airplanes. This is the cabin area of a L-1049 or the Super Constellation. This is the navigator station. This is the table where the maps were all laid out. The navigator had all of his own instruments here, airspeed, altitude, temperature, and all that. This is a scope for a Loran. Loran was the long-range navigation in those days. Other than a sextant, and most of the pilots that were with the Wrangler or Bluebell were qualified navigators out of the service, so could use the sextant. And it went into a little hole right through the ceiling right up here. This is the bathroom, which was not recommended for a bath, and this is the bunks where the crews could rest in flight or doing ground maintenance or whatever, and this operation, as long as the days were, they got a lot of use. "1-2 Charlie" in 1970 in Miami, a really nice looking airplane. Another picture in the Greensboro newspaper. This is yours truly right here. I had to stick this in here so that you all would believe me that maybe I knew a little bit of what I was talking about. Here's a year later, another good picture of the airplane that got a lot of publicity in Miami, Florida. Notice when they got the airplanes, they retained the old Flying Tiger lines or paint on the stripe on the airplane. They just added the Wrangler and the logo and the jeans and sportswear. And they put a big Bluebell right here where it used to say Flying Tiger. This is an NTSB abbreviated report of an incident going into Miami in October of '71, where the elevator on the 1-2 Charlie cracked in flight, and it caused some flight control difficulties. It was determined that someplace in its earlier history with Flying Tigers, when they were having all their crashes, that particular elevator had been damaged and cracked somehow. Then 22 Charlie arrives in Greensboro in October of 1971. Notice it's still in the CIA paint job. And there was a big blue Wrangler painted on the side of it, which make a note of that. It caused a little bit of commotion in the hierarchy in the company there, Bluebell, because it was not the same logo that was trademarked that you saw with the Wrangler all written out with the rope and all of that kind of stuff. And the hierarchy in the company wanted to take it off of the airplane and put the other one. But the flight department was kind of anxious to get it going, and about the same time, believe it or not, the people around in town started commenting to the wheels how they liked to read that Wrangler when it flew low over town, the town of Greensboro lot. So believe it or not, management of the company said, leave it there and make a note of it because it was there for a while, and we'll talk about that later. So with two airplanes, the goal was to have one in the air all the time, eventually getting up to about 5 flights a week. Somebody thought up that we could save a lot of money if we flew the airplane to Puerto Rico from Greensboro, reloaded it, and took it back to Miami. And at the same time the airplane left Greensboro, a truck with the 40,000 pounds we talked about left Greenville down here, headed on down the highway and made it to Miami about the same time that this airplane arrived back in Miami. Then overnight it would be offloaded and reloaded, and maintenance could be conducted on the airplane. And then as soon as the load was offloaded, the truck could head on back up here to a Wilson, North Carolina facility just over here in eastern North Carolina for distribution. The airplane the next morning would go back to Puerto Rico and then back to Greensboro. Keep in mind, in this era was when Federal Express was just starting their operation with the Falcon jets and the overnight deliveries. But in essence, Wrangler Aviation here at this time was able to do that on a much larger scale because they could take the orders and get the cloth loaded and delivered out in the morning out of Greensboro on the way to Puerto Rico. When it arrived midday, it would be taken to the cutting rooms, sewed up for the prescribed customer, loaded on the next morning and back in North Carolina that evening and en route to the distribution center, either up in Luray, Virginia or Wilson, for basically next day service for customers 60 years ago. So it was, no other company was doing that at the time, and it was it was good for business. Now people ask if we ever had any concerns about flying through the Devil's Triangle here, and not really, because mostly we were asleep at night. But there were a few instances I might mention. One night we were flying along out here in the airplane, and this little airplane came up on the radio very loud and clear. And he was trying to reach air traffic control over here in North Carolina, and he couldn't reach him. And he couldn't reach him because the wind had come up and his navigation was bad, and he had blown clear out here someplace. He was trying to fly from up on Long Island down to Miami, but ended out here. Now, we didn't know where he was, but we knew that he was very loud and clear, so we were near him. So the advice we gave him that he listened to was he'd better turn on a westerly heading and fly this way. And he did a few hours later land safely in Wilmington, North Carolina. Another instance, we located an airplane that had crash landed down here in the islands, and stayed with that until the Coast Guard came. They had their lifeboats out and were standing on the wing of this little airplane. But that's about our only experiences with the Devil's Triangle. This is how the airplane was loaded with the floor keeper. That guy's name is Gary Geringer. I don't suppose any of you know him. He lived up in Reidsville, North Carolina. This is the way the cloth came from the mills, where it was manufactured in big rolls. We used a forklift to put it up on the airplane, and then it was moved up inside. There's Geringer again, but this airplane is being loaded. they would get pretty high in this airplane, and they weighed several hundred pounds for each one of these, and they had to be manhandled, so it was kind of labor intensive. I was tied down with these straps, and there was a barrier up in front here to keep all of these bales from coming up in the cockpit if you made a bad landing. But the system worked well. Then somebody in the company had the bright idea of coming up with and building a loading dock here that could be moved under the airplane, and they got two flatbed trailers, one for a couple of destinations that we had, bolted them together, welded them together, put a barrier on here so the forklift wouldn't come off. They put the forklift up on these trailers, and then they brought the trailers that were carrying the products either to the airplane or away from the airplane, backed them up here. The forklift could drive right in the trailer, pick up the freight, set it right up here on the airplane, or take from the airplane what was going on in the trailers and drive it right back into the trailer. So that let us turn an airplane in about 3 hours, which was pretty good for that day in air. This is called a pallet jack that had wheels on it, and it could handle the skids like was under here, the skid being under this. They'd set this pallet up there with those boxes on it of Wrangler jeans, run the pallet jack under it, and move them on up into the airplane. Then somebody in the company had the bright idea of getting these big boxes, collapsible boxes, that would hold about 1,000, 1,200 pounds of 500 or 600 pairs of jeans, fill them up, put them on a plastic pallet that could be handled with that pallet jack, and note they were designed to fit 3 across in the airplane, and it worked like a charm. Also, it could go 2 across in the 40,000-pound trailer, and you could take one of these pallets and stack it up on top of another box, and it fit perfectly into the tractor trailers that you see going down the road. Now, when it made it to the distribution center and the box was emptied out, this was collapsible. The box could be collapsed back down. They folded them up. They took these plastic pallets, made them all in a big stack, and put the boxes on top and sent them all back down to Puerto Rico, where they were used for quite a long period of time, for they were a very sturdy box. And somebody had a pretty good idea on that too. This is both airplanes down in Puerto Rico on a photo occasion. There's the company van, which is a worn-out old Volkswagen bus that had a top speed of about 35 miles an hour, but it made it all over the island. Now, if you were able to get a picture of both of these airplanes on the island at the same time, what it really means, if you're experienced in aviation, is that they're both broken down at the same time in the same place. Now, this is a flight crew over here supervising this mechanic. Probably just changed the cylinder on the airplane. Now, this engine is known to be externally lubricated with oil. It used a lot of oil. They leaked badly. It burned it, and it was always falling off the airplanes. If you can see this picture close up here, this co-pilot fella has big black spots all over his shirt, which means that he walked under the airplane. Now, in the left wing or the port wing of all of these constellations, there was a big 60-gallon oil tank that where the engine oil was maintained. And we filled that with 40-gallon drums with the same forklifts we saw before, but put the barrel of oil up on the hold it over the wing, and with the hose plugged into or bolted into the drum, would put about 40 gallons of 100 weight, I guess, oil, whatever it was, down into this tank. Now, the flight engineer, among his duties on the airplane, could transfer the oil from that tank to any one of these engines, or he could transfer it in between the engines. So this airplane was a big boost for the oil manufacturers too. There's Miami in '72. Somebody decided to sell the airplanes in August 1973. They sold them to a company in Stephenville, Newfoundland. The purpose of these airplanes was to fly lobster and fish and shrimp from Newfoundland to New York City, and they did that for several years on a daily basis. But then about 5 years later, their business fell apart for some reason, I don't know, and they decided to go out of business, and they sold 1-2 Charlie for scrap, and 2-2 Charlie went back to Miami. But if you think that isn't a sad day when you spend a lot of time in an airplane, and then that's the memory you have it right there being all cut up and sold for scrap, it's kind of depressing. So like we said, 2-2 Charlie went on to Miami and worked out of the airport there at that time. Miami was a large airport for old airplanes that flew cargo all over the Caribbean and South America. And it was kind of home base for them because there was a lot of them there, and there's a lot of maintenance facilities in Miami. And on the southwest part of the airport in particular was where a bunch of the airplanes were. Looks like a DC-6 there and maybe a DC-4 here. And it was called Cockroach Corner because it was quite cluttered and dangerous to be in. And there's the lead mechanic working on 1-2 Charlie at that time in his maintenance vehicle. State-of-the-art thing. It was leased for a while by Aviation Airlines that flew some charters. Then they decided to make a commercial out of it and painted it all up all bright and colored because the Lockheed Constellation, or the Connies, was Iberia's big airplane for years. So it had a little movie fame. And then in 1981, it was sold for a $225 to somebody, I don't know who, that took it up to Sanford, Florida, which is up north of Orlando. And it sat out there in the sun for several years, and you see the paint job is washing off here. It must have been whitewash or something. And you can still see that Wrangler on there 10 years after it was initially painted on the airplane. So there it's set, and that's 1981. This is 6 years later. It's still there, it's still corroding. The paint is all washed off, and you can still see the Wrangler 16 years after it went on. This guy must have flown his little airplane up there to look at it to see to buy it, which they did. And it was sold to a Dominican airline operating out of the Dominican Republic for a couple of years. And it was popular around that part of the country, had a fancy paint job on it. And it was a good-looking airplane. And then suddenly some more bad luck. On February the 2nd, 1992, another airplane from this Dominican airline ran into this 2-2 Charlie sitting on the line down there in Puerto Rico. And that's the way it ended up. It doesn't look like it's going to be airworthy for a while, so that's where it's at. And then a few years later, in 2006, it was still there. And if you look closely, you can still see the Wrangler here, but it's kind of starting to fade out if you believe it. 10 years after that, it's still sitting there. And it looks a little worse for wear. You can see it's probably not going to be airworthy for a while.
This aircraft has a big history, the aircraft itself and the type itself. Yes, well, we'll just listen to the sound of it first of all, and as it passes, you can see the flames. These are from the exhausts. This was the airliner version. It is an aircraft, of course, that brought Australia much closer to the rest of the world. It was also the aircraft that perhaps turned Qantas into truly a global airline.
It operated on the Kangaroo route and across the Pacific, John?
Yes, that's correct. It had the...
disconcerting, John, for the first-time flyers to see all the engines. Reverse pitch. Matter of fact, this was one of the very first airliners that they actually were able to back, and they did that in the original tests in the 1940s when they developed the Constellation, and of course the Super Constellation is the stretch version by about 17 feet from the original Constellation aircraft.
Well, certainly a magnificent example of airliners, the Super Connie, and I know that there are lots and lots of people who were shedding tears when it went out of service in this country and other airlines across the world, because it's, as I said, probably the most beautiful airliner that was ever built.
Well, we think so. Even the call sign, Echo Alpha Golf, that was the very first 1049 Super Constellation that Qantas had, and it was the last to leave Australia in March 1963. And
now this is the airplane that is sitting there today in 4 years ago. That's after the hurricane blew the airplane around a little bit, but it survived the hurricanes in Puerto Rico in 2017. This photo was taken a year and a half ago, sitting there in the same site. Looks completely unairworthy. There as it sits last year in front of the Lufthansa hangar, which is located right behind us and is used by Lufthansa to overhaul and do maintenance on the large airliners nowadays. The airplane is still sitting there. A recent check last week at the satellite photos of the airport show that it is still there. Now, a lot of people ask, what became of Wrangler Aviation and Bluebell after all of the airplanes were gone? And that's what happened right there. They acquired a Canadair CL-44 that was also purchased from Flying Tiger. It carried a much larger payload than the Constellations and went a lot faster, and it went a lot further. And it could do all of the work with one airplane that the Constellations did. It could also go to Europe on a weekly basis or more frequently, where the Bluebell had manufacturing facilities there. The longest destination that it regularly flew to was on the island of Malta, which is about 11-hour flight out of Greensboro, which for all practical terms is a big butt buster. Now this is the CL-44. The tail would open up on it on a splice right here and swing around, and the cargo could be loaded in the back of the airplane. So then after this, what happened? It went from that airplane, which was number 1, to a number 2, a number 3, and number 4. There's a tail, one of them sitting there with the tail open for loading. And then it went on to airplanes 5, 6, and 7. And then the airline was sold to a company called Tradewinds that kind of destroyed the business and had to go out of business, and the management of the company was pretty corrupt, and it made all the newspapers because some of them actually went to jail for things that they did with the airplanes. So that's the end. If you enjoyed it, I thank you. If not, I thank you anyhow. And I understand that this is going to be presented again this Saturday. So if you tell your friends, they can watch it again, and you can watch it again too if you like. And once again, thank you.